How's it going, Coffee Nation? In this video, we're going to be doing a breakdown of class and role. So we're going to be assigning each class a role, and I have the roles here. We have damage. These are units who either do crit builds, they just one round. It can be any weapon type, it doesn't matter. We have tanks. This includes physical tanks, res tanks, avoid tanks. We have utility. These are units like Chi Adepts, Dancer, Chain Guarders, Enchanter, Healers, stuff like this. We have Bruiser, which is kind of a hybrid between damage and tank, but it kind of exists in a space where it can tank a few things and deal a little bit of damage, but I wouldn't call it either. And then we just have Hybrid, which combines drastically different roles. Tank is similar to damage in that it tends to deal damage, but a hybrid is typically like utility tank, utility damage, and so on. All right, so to begin, we have our boy Alfredo Sauce on his Avenir class. So this is more of a bruiser class, even though he's not like the best unit. You can get him online to a point where he can kind of be tanky, and with DLC and Starsphere, he can easily be like a bruiser on this class, but it's definitely not a damage or a tank class. So I'd say Avenir is like a bruiser. Next we have Berserker. This is a damage class. It emphasizes high strength growth and some HP, but low defenses, so it's all about the damage. Next we have Bow Knight. Bow Knight is definitely a damage class. It just wants to shoot things down and stab them with a spear. It's pretty good at that to some degree. There's definitely better options, but it's not bad, and it has some use cases. Next is Mage Cannoneer. This one's interesting. I would say Mage Cannoneer is kind of like a hybrid because it has some utility. So it's a kind of a hybrid between utility and damage. It doesn't have the best damage and doesn't have the best utility, but it can do a lot of interesting things, especially when you start using Draconic Hex. It can also debuff things with big stacks of poison to increase damage, so it can set up kills. And it can also do other things, like there's different utility cannonballs or cannons or whatever. So it has like a bit of utility, a bit of damage. I would say it's a hybrid. Next we have Cupido. This is just clearly a damage class. It's just meant to shoot things down. It can use Radiant Bow for some good damage. It doesn't have tanking. It doesn't have utility. It doesn't have durability. It just kind of goes in and shoots guys. Dancer, easy utility class. That's all it does is utility. It does 0 damage, does no tanking. It has Chain Guard and Dancing. So pure utility. Next we have the Divine Dragon class. Now, I would say this is a damage class. It's not really well, you could argue it's hybrid because it gets utility from being a dragon class and potentially unlocking utility, but the class itself is just kind of like a straightforward damage class. It's not a tank, it's not a bruiser, it's not really a hybrid. Next we have the Physical Fell Dragon. I would say this is a damage class. Let me scroll down here. All it does is uses dragon stones and axes or lances, depending on which of the twins you're running, and you smack things with weapons and kill them. It doesn't tank, no utility, it's not really a bruiser. To some degree, it's bruiser-ish, but I don't think... Maybe it's a bruiser. Maybe. It's hard to say. I think it's more damage than bruiser. Next we have Enchanter. This is pure utility. The class itself doesn't deal damage, but it buffs things, and that's like its main thing is buffing allies, so that's its whole thing is just raw utility. Next we have Veil. So Veil's class is also a damage class. It's similar to Sage. Its weapons are daggers and tomes. It completely exists for the sole purpose of killing things. It has a little bit of utility in the fact that it's a dragon class, and that can unlock certain abilities on certain emblems, but that would be more of the emblems pushing it into something else than it being not a damage class. General is a tank. I think that's fair to say. General can physical tank very well. It tends to have low speed and gets doubled by things, but when its defense is high enough, it can mitigate damage or nullify damage from physical. It tends to be weak to mages. It tends to have low speed and low res, making it uniquely susceptible to magic damage, but it can tank physical very well, and with pure water, it can still tank magic to some degree. So it's a tank, it's low mobility, high armor. Armored Knight, I would say, is also a tank role. I almost want to put it in Bruiser, but it actually, unlike General, has the option to become fast enough to not get doubled, and it does have higher res, so it can be broken. General can't be broken, regardless of weapon triangle, but Armored Knight can. So, or I'm sorry, is this Great Knight? Yeah, Great Knight. It's an armored mounted unit, all right? So Great Knight can tank, it can do multiple weapon types. It's kind of like a bruiser in a way, but I would argue it's like a main tank that tends not to like kill things that well. It's definitely better at tanking than dealing damage. Bruiser is something that kind of is like mixed between, and hybrid is like utility plus a thing. Griffin Knight, I would say, is a hybrid. It's a mixture of damage and utility. It doesn't tank well, and it doesn't off-tank well. So another way to look at Bruiser is off-tank. It's not letting me put the K in for some reason. It's not letting me put the K in. All right, there we go. All right, off-tank, there you go. So, for example, I would say Halberdier is a good off-tank. This is Halberdier, this is not Picket. So an off-tank is a class that's fast enough to not get doubled, that has like average or above average defensive bases and res base, and good enough speed to either double or not get doubled, and good HP pool. So I would say that's Halberdier. It's a combination of damage and tank. It's a bruiser. So, whereas hybrid is tank or damage plus utility. All right. Halberdier, bruiser, I think that's fair. Hero, I would say, is also a bruiser. Hero has, especially Goldmary, she has really good defense, and she is pretty tanky on Hero. She's not so tanky that she can tank as well as these without help, like these class types, these class types. So she can still tank a good amount, though, so it's kind of like the definition of a bruiser. I wouldn't say Hero is like a damage class because it can enable damage through chain assists, but it by itself needs like heavy speed fixing or a very fast unit to boost its damage up to compete with other damage classes. So it's definitely... Now, Bruiser doesn't mean it has bad damage, though. It can still be a good damage unit. It also can just tank. Priest, I would say, is mostly utility. High Priest. It does have a little bit of damage to it, but it's mostly used for healing and staff use. Its damage is worse than Sage and Mage Knight, but it does have access to tomes and can deal respectable damage, especially on Pandreo. So it's definitely not made to be a damage unit, though. It's mostly going to be a utility healer and staff user. Lindworm, I would say... Actually, Lindworm's a hybrid, yeah, because it has staff use and it has tomes. So it's the definition of a hybrid class. You have staff utility access as well as good access to damage. I almost wanted to call him Lindcrust. Lindheart, that's a completely different game. Alcrysts, Tier D Elite or whatever class. It's a damage class. You shoot things down, you get Luna triggers. Mage Knight, damage class. You have tomes and, a physical weapon. A martial weapon, I should say. You have access to a weapon triangle weapon plus tomes. No utility, you just attack stuff, and you do it quickly. Martial Master, utility. Chain guarding, can also punch things to death. It can't really off-tank very well, so I wouldn't put it in Bruiser. For hybrid, you could argue it's a hybrid because it can punch things. It uses, it has staff use, chain. Its main thing is staff use and chain guard and maybe bonded shield and stuff like this, or utility emblems. So I don't really think that the class is a damage class. It needs specific builds to be a damage class, whereas these are designed to be damage classes. So for that reason, I would just keep it in utility. Melusin, Zelestia's thing. Zestia, whatever. You know the new DLC lady on the dragon. It's like the Mage Knight of the Skies. Melusin. It's swords plus tomes. There's no utility. You just attack. You attack. All right. Paladin, damage. It literally just has access to a weapon, and it has pivot or whatever, and that's all it can do. It just attacks things. Picket, I would actually say, is a tank. A lot of people use this class wrong, I would say. It's a tank class. It's meant to be kind of similar to Great Knight. It's a fast unit, a fast class / unit that has decent res and above average defense. And when used correctly, it can enemy phase as effectively as these, easily, with little effort. And I've done this on multiple playthroughs where I've used Tamara as a tank on Picket. It's actually a tank class. I think it can be made into a damage class, but its default use is a tank. Royal Knight is definitely a hybrid. You have lance access as well as staff access, so it's kind of like a grounded Griffin Knight. That's another way of looking at it. People love Griffin Knight. Royal Knight is very similar to that. Honestly, Royal Knight might be a little bit better than we realize. It's growths, so I'll kind of compare them really quickly. So Griffin Knight has 10% strength, 20% speed, and 15% magic. No defense, 15% res. And then Royal Knight has 10% strength, 15% magic, 15% speed, 5% defense, 20% res. So it's very similar growths, and I think it even has higher strength than Griffin Knight, but it's very much like the Griffin Knight of the ground. And honestly, I probably underrate it too, so I wouldn't blame you if you did. Sage, it's a damage. Well, actually, no. Sage is a hybrid. Sage has tome access and staves, so you can have utility, you can heal, you can hit dudes with a magic. So it's very much a hybrid class. It can do both. Hortensia's class, Sleipnir Rider, I would say is a hybrid. I think that's fair because she has tome access and staff access, and she can kind of be good. Maybe you could argue she's more utility. Actually, I feel like she's like more utility than hybrid because I do feel like her combat's lacking. That's kind of why I have High Priest here, because even though it can attack, its combat isn't like so standout that it's like hybrid. These actually, their combat's good enough where I feel like I would consider them like a split between utility and damage. Whereas these, Pandreo uniquely can make High Priest look really good, but very few units can pop off on High Priest. So it's more of like a utility that has access to damage. Sniper, this is just Etier, but this is Sniper. Sniper is a damage class. That's all it does. All it does is just wants to deal damage. It doesn't tank very well. It has no utility. It just shoots bows. It shoots bows at people. It doesn't shoot arrows, it shoots bows. Next we have Diamant. I would say he's a bruiser. I wouldn't put him in a tank role because he needs like a specific build to get him tanking consistently. But he's definitely like a bruiser by default, and as you use him, he's a bruiser. His tanking is kind of reliant on a random trigger to occur that's not the highest success rate. So yeah, I don't think he's like a tank necessarily, but he's definitely tanky. He's like a tanky damage dealer. Kagetsu, Kagetsu. Swordmaster is a damage class. Yeah, sometimes I see the unit and say the unit. Swordmaster is a damage class. It has no access to utility. Its only ability allows it to move an extra tile, to go behind something when it attacks it. And that's pretty much it. It's like an extra, all of its things are geared towards offense, essentially. Thief, I actually think is a tank. I don't think Thief is a damage unit. I think it's a tank. I define a tank as a unit archetype who enemy phases well, so survives more combats than other units can, and deals damage or kills those enemies. And all of these do that. And I think Thief can be used for damage, but I think it tends to not be as good as most damage classes for killing things in a single round of combat, whereas it definitely excels more in like the chip damage, just keep whittling them down with doubling for low to medium damage. Thief's damage isn't the best on Maddening mode, like mid to late game. It starts to kind of fall off a bit. Enemies start having really high defense. So you start not hitting that hard. There's also not obvious ways to boost your damage output if you're not running DLC. Like there's no like knife power, for example. So it's kind of hard to boost the damage up. You could run like Strength +6 on Roy or some of the hybrid DLC things like Strength Plus and turn it into more of a damage unit. But I would say its default use case is in a void tank. Salene's Vidam. Hybrid. It does. Honestly, I wish there was more classes like this. I find that her class is very interesting. Like she has access to 3 things. She has staves, tomes, swords. We need more tribrid classes. These are really cool. And she also has an interesting utility that within 1 to 2 range boosts. This is her personal skill, but it boosts the effectiveness of heal. So I feel like we need more classes that are hybrids and tribrids and stuff like this. She doesn't excel in anything, but she has a little bit of everything. This class has access to utility. It has access to damage. It has access to, Bolganone, Levin Sword, all these things. You can run like sword power and do fun things like that. but it's definitely a hybrid class. It does a little bit of everything. And then finally, we have Warrior, which is a damage class. It has no utility at all. Everything it does is damage. It has axes and bows. And if a dude is broken, you deal 50% damage to them. Or, I'm sorry, 50% more damage to them. So just all about the damage. So this is not a rating as to how good each of these classes are. It's more of a guide or tool that you can use to figure out what each class wants to do and why. So when you're making a team comp and you have like 5 thieves and you're like, why are we lacking utility? It's like, oh yeah, it's a tank. It's a tank that has damage. Or like if you're running a bunch of snipers and you have no tanks and you're wondering why your team just keeps getting run through for whatever reason, you're like, oh, we have no tanks, we have no utility. Generally, when I make a team comp, I try to have, a lot of damage units, like 2 to 3 tanks, maybe a few bruisers, and then some utility. Like, you need utilities. Damage, tank, and utility, I would say, are essential. And then hybrids are just flex versions of these. So, for example, like a bruiser is like a flex between a damage and a tank, and a hybrid is a flex between a damage and a utility. So if you want a bunch of hybrids, now you have some utility, now you have some damage. So having like an Ivy and a Chloe or a Wyvern Knight, whatever, you get that staff access, you get damage. So I would say these units tend to be worse at combat than most of these. Classes tend to be worse at combat than these classes. Most of these classes, now some of these are kind of subpar, like Swordmaster, some people might say is bad, and Bow Knight and so on, and Berserker. But most of the classes in damage tend to excel in killing things. Oh yeah, I'm missing Wyvern, aren't I? I know I saved it though. Like I made this list myself, like screenshotting. I definitely saved the list. Wyvern goes into damage. Yeah, I definitely saved Rosado image. I don't know where it went. But yeah, Wyvern goes into damage, if you're wondering why it's not here. I don't know why. It must have not gotten uploaded with the set when I made this list. But Wyvern is definitely damage. It has 2 weapon types. It can situationally break and avoid being broken. It has a really good passive that can allow it to double land units and out of bounds tiles, which are on most maps, if not all maps. Like even stupid little things like a tiny little rock. Like let's say there's just like some rock or some little pillar or some wall. Anything can be considered out of bounds. So as long as you set up your defenses well and get enemies to go where you want them to, you can set up its doubling. It's also very fast. It's high damage. Wyvern's one of the best classes in the game, alongside like Warrior and stuff like that. But yeah, Wyvern's a damage. It should be here. But yeah, this is my list for the classes and where they sit in terms of role. I think these are like fundamental roles that are in most games. And these 2 are just like subcategories of these 3. So these are like your primary roles, and these are just like flex units. So, having Halberdier, Hero, Diamant. I feel like Halberdier and Hero are generically more bruisery than these because they can be run on any unit. But Gold Mary is a really good bruiser off tank with no effort, and General, Great Knights, Picket, Thief. These are all really good tank unit types. But yeah, that's it for this one. Definitely like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Feel free to drop a comment, let me know what you think, and I'll see you next one.